Welcome to Ask a Composer. I'm Devin Patrick Hughes. Thank you for joining and listening. This is the opportunity to hear some awesome playlists from contemporary composers. You can check out the playlists below. There's a Spotify link and an Apple Music link. Please feel free to ask questions, comment, subscribe, and let me know if there are any composers you would like me to interview in the future. Enjoy the interview. So welcome. I'm here with composer Jonathan Bingham. Jonathan Bingham's music has been performed all over the world, places like New York's Domena Center for Classical Music, Sienna's Summer Music Festival in Italy, BFI's London Film Festival, and the Film Society of Lincoln Center. He's most recently composed for the Jack Quartet, the Boulder Symphony, and was recently the composer in residence with the Arapahoe Philharmonic. Jonathan, welcome to Ask a Composer. And Jonathan, your first playlist that you sent me was incredible. It's like 4 concerts worth of material. Some of it I've actually conducted before, but most of it not. And yeah, you've blown my mind in many different ways. So yeah, can you talk about the concept for your playlist?
Sure. Ever since graduation, I've had an even larger fascination with new music. And I've been trying to force myself to listen to music to composers who are still alive or those who have just passed away recently. When I say recently, I mean within the past 10 years or so. I think that, classical music nowadays is probably as diverse in sound as it's ever been. So that's a huge opportunity for me to just look at different works and get to know different composers that are still in my community, and it's the best way to learn.
Maybe before you get into your playlist, you had a really unique career getting into the composition field. Can you briefly just talk about how you started composing?
Yeah, I was pretty late coming into the game. I was 19 and already in school with no background in classical music. And I started listening to the music of films, and it really drew me into orchestral music. And I wanted to know where this art form had really come from. So one thing led to another. And long story short, I ended up applying to graduate programs before my undergraduate degree because I wasn't aware of the particular requirements. So they notified me saying, "Thank you for your interest, but you need a degree in composition before you can just come into these programs." So that's what led me to studying composition at first. I transferred from the current school I was at. I was studying music technology at the time and decided to go into composition. And I started at Howard in DC from scratch. I couldn't really read music. I'm not sure why my teacher took me on, but he did. He saw something. He said, "All right, well, we'll just start out with quarter notes." And then we started learning how to write for string quartet. And here I am.
And we've done some projects together. We premiered some great music of yours together with orchestras. And in the pre-concert talks, we always get into some of your influences. And I'm always astounded at your influence are not like, starting with Bach, Haydn, Beethoven. Your influences are much more eclectic than I would say your average 21st century symphonic music composer.
Yeah, no, that's true. I noticed that when I got into composing, that a lot of my peers, since they had been studying music since 4 or 5 years old, they had been introduced to everyone in the right order, Bach and Beethoven and so on. For me, everything was more so all at once. We did have music history classes, of course, but in composition lessons, that's where all the 20th century literature was coming at me quick. So I was just trying to take bits and pieces of whatever I could, whatever I liked, and that became my sound. That became the structure of my influence.
So in the recent concerts that I'm just remembering, you've been paired with Sibelius Second Symphony, Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique, and now you have complete control over the programming. You don't have to be paired with anybody you don't want to. So could you go into your playlist?
Sure. Let me pull it up right quick. First was comes up the Concerto for Orchestra by Jennifer Higdon. The reason why I put this on the playlist is that I found this piece in my undergrad, and my undergraduate teacher was I don't want to go as far to say he was a serialist, but he was very influenced by that style of music. And I was curious to find out, was there tonal music that still existed in the 21st century? And just Google searching around, landed on Jennifer Higdon. We're both from the same area, or she teaches in Philadelphia, and I live near Philadelphia. So that kind of brought me closer into to see what the area has brought out as far as classical composition. I mean, the lineage is Samuel Barber, George Crumb teaches at UPenn, I believe. So I was very interested to find out what's going on in my neck of the woods, and here it was. I thought it was a really interesting piece. I mean, I read a review. Someone had compared it to Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra, or they labeled it as this generation's Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra. I'm paraphrasing, but I really enjoyed it. Since it is a bit tonal, I don't want to say that tonal music is by default. Um, uh, I hesitate to say corny sometimes, but by default, it seems to lack interest. So it's just more of a challenge. Can you make an interesting piece of music, or an interesting piece of tonal music, actually interesting to the point where people would want to hear it and hear something new with it? So it's definitely a challenge. I would say more of a challenge to write tonal music these days than anything else. But she really pulled it off and let me know what tonal music, how that can sound, and what role it can play in our environment today.
Yeah, and you really sparked my interest and curiosity with that one, because Jennifer Higdon is someone who, from the beginning, when I started conducting, two of my teachers were close with her and introduced me to Blue Cathedral, which is a fantastic piece of music. And also there's a piece called Loco, both of which I've conducted Loco a couple of times. Actually, the Concerto for Orchestra, I had that planned on a season coming up
Oh,
to be,
wow.
I think, played in November. We'll see if that happens.
Wow, I would
But
love to see that.
but yeah, you're. I mean, the idea of the concerto, a solo player with a larger group, so kind of the lone voice pitted against the mass in a way. And then all of a sudden, in like the 20th century, you mentioned Bartok, composers started writing concertos for entire orchestras, so concertos for like 80 people. So nobody's an accompanist. Every single person is on display at the highest virtuosic level. I thought it was interesting that you picked that. Is that something that reaches to you as a possible future project?
It would be a dream, and that would be a very intimidating project because, as you said, normally concertos, they've already had their role with a soloist. So putting it up with the orchestra entirely, that's a very novel activity in this environment. So it would be something I would be interested in, only because it's something that would have to, it would really push me to learn the orchestra. I studied composition obviously, but I'd have to say that the element of composition that kind of fell to the wayside for myself, and from what I hear most composers as well, is orchestration. So it's definitely a challenge to be able to take the entire orchestra and kind of be able to give each section of the orchestra its own time to shine with its own writing that makes it sound that this could only be written for this particular instrument.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned you found Jennifer Higdon because you were looking at 21st century composers. Jennifer Higdon's born in 1962 in Brooklyn. She moved to Atlanta. She was in Atlanta for her first 10 years, so she's part of the Atlanta school. People like her, Christopher Theophanides. But you mentioned you liked her because she kind of went against the trend of serialism, and so that would I think is a nice transition into your Dutilleux symphonies.
Yeah.
This is a French composer, Henri Dutilleux, 1916 to 2013, who I must admit I have never conducted his music. I don't think I've ever looked at his score. But post post-impressionism French, you basically have like, Boulez, right? And that's highly serialistic. And so Dutilleux rebelled against this. He was writing in these gorgeous idioms, creating these beautiful orchestral colors. Um, can you talk a little bit about his symphonies, his first and second symphonies that you recommended?
Sure. First, let me say that I always looked at him as the next chapter in the book that Debussy and Ravel were writing. So, me coming into classical music, I always say that Debussy is probably the easiest composer to listen to if you're just starting out. At least it was for me. So, I mean, getting to know his work, it was very easy to fall in to. But his symphonies, I remember the first time hearing that my teacher at the time in grad school, Justin Della Gioia, he had asked if I had ever heard of his work, and I said no. And he was like, "Are you kidding me?" And he just kind of we started out with his string quartet, and then we moved on to his symphonies. And I have to say, it was the first time in my life that I felt intimidated to the point where, not that I considered quitting, but the thought of it just entered my mind because the bar was so high. I thought to myself, well, if I am gonna quit composition, this is a pretty good time to do it, because Dutilleux had done with an orchestra everything that I had ever imagined could be done with an orchestra, or at least from the standpoint of, I won't say total tonal, but you get the picture when you listen to his music. The orchestration was very dense. There were things that were orchestrated that I was told not to do by certain teachers because, it just would not work. And clearly, somehow, he made it work. I began studying his music with the first symphony. I honestly got from that one piece what I could normally get from an entire orchestration book. I mean, that's how dense it was with just information, with novelty. It became one of my favorite works to listen to. That's not to say that I can listen to it every single day, because it's a lot. I definitely have to mentally prepare myself and sit down and say that I'm going to not only enjoy this piece, but I'm going to be taking this in as a little masterclass.
And I think, and that's the art when we talk about orchestration. Because why is it that one composer can write 100 different voices or 80 different voices, and you can hear every single one of them, whereas another composer, it's just a massive sound, right?
Yeah, right.
And that's what I think in these symphonies. And of course, he's got cello concerto, violin concerto, all this other great music that was actually recorded recently by the Seattle Symphony.
Yeah,
It just, all the voices just speak worlds, and they weave in and out like it's magical.
right.
So yeah, this is amazing. While we're in the France region, why don't we pop over to Estonia? You picked another one of my favorite composers, a piece that I've conducted a couple times, the Fratres, but also the Passacaglia. Can you talk about those two works? And I guess also with the Fratres, you might have to specify. Well, the Passacaglia, I think there's two versions, but the Fratres, there's like 16 different versions. So,
Yeah.
which one are you listening to? Is the question.
Well, for the playlist, I put the orchestral version, but when I first heard it, it was with violin and piano.
Okay.
And I remember the first time I heard it, I immediately had to listen to the whole thing again, and this time pulled out the score online and just and look to see how paired could take such simple elements and just really expand it out. But yeah, to answer your question, I was listening to the violin and piano mostly.
Yeah, so I think the two more performed versions are the violin and piano, and then the second most performed version, I think, is the string orchestra with percussion.
Right.
And they're two very different versions. The solo violin is arpeggios, all up and down, 16 notes continuously, and it's the tintinnabuli style. I don't know if you're familiar with that
Yeah.
style. Maybe
Yeah.
you can talk about it in a second. That he gets by combining these intervals in like a tenth, and then squeezing the third note of the triad in between. So this really amazing spacing, which works wonders for many, like How to Train Your Dragon, John Powell, like that first movie used that dee da da da, that very simple.
Hmm.
Um, And so yeah, can you maybe talk about Arvo Pärt? And he also had around the 1960s. He didn't compose for like 8 or 9 years, and he kind of had a shift in his compositional style. Can you maybe talk about the Passacaglia and the Fratres, and then the Tintinnabuli style as a
Yeah.
composer?
Yeah, I've tried to take on that style with a piece that I was writing for piano and cello, just as an experiment. Didn't work out as well as Parrot could prove it to be, but yeah, it's when I first heard these works, they came a little later in my whole matriculation. Like I said before, I mean, Parrot's work, they were just based on simple elements, you know, and they seem to be expanded to a larger time limit. Um, when it came to listening to Passacaglia, my teacher actually told me about it, but he forgot the name of the work. So he couldn't. I said, I can't look it up to listen to it, but he kept telling me for weeks. He's like, there's this piece for violin and orchestra by Pärt that you have to listen to. It's brilliant. And I was a little surprised because he was more of a traditionalist. You know,
Yeah.
he's a little older, and, you know, 20th century literature was being written when he was in school. So most of it he rejected. But
Maybe he thought it was a chaconne.
right, you know, he did bring that up, and I ended up finding it. I was like, "Is this it?" He said, "Yeah, that's it." So that became a very, very popular piece, at least on my playlist. I started listening to it. The other one, I actually just started listening to this break. I hadn't heard it, so that's why it was special to me, and I that's why I had to listen or put it into this playlist. But but yeah, it was the uh, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this. Fratre.
Oh, I've always said Fratres, like, but you can.
Okay.
Which one?
Yeah, yeah, Fratres.
Yeah, yeah,
Fratres.
yeah, yeah. And I think he, because at that time he went to this medieval music, like went into this medieval, because he was composing pretty dissonant stuff before 1966. And so I think this is like brotherhood in terms of like the monks. You know, that's what he's thinking of in this.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, the medieval part, because I mean, like in the 20th century, it doesn't get the reputation that music is tonal, but composers like Pärt, you know, a perfect example of what tonality can be. It doesn't have to be the 1 4 5 1. I don't like to consider myself a tonal composer, although my music, you know, tonality finds its way in there. But I like to use it as a tool, and to use experiments with other elements of music, harmony, rhythm. That way, tonality can be put in there without it being too cheesy, for lack of a better way of saying it.
Definitely tonality is going to put butts in the seats.
Right, right.
I remember when, so my first, when I, well, I say my first master's degree, when I went to school, my first teacher there, she asked me, what do you like? I said Brahms, Robert Schumann, you know, Mozart. So she gives me Jennifer Higdon, you know, Blue Cathedral, uh, Cantus in Memory of Benjamin Britten by Arvo Pärt, which is also another fantastic piece of music in its simplicity. And when you listen to Arvo Pärt by like the Fratres or the Cantus in Memory of Benjamin Britten, you almost want to say minimalism, but that doesn't do it justice. It's not minimalism. Well, what
Yeah.
do you think about that? Have you considered that
Yeah,
label?
yeah. I mean, when it comes to minimalism, seems to be set in a very short time frame in the second half of the 20th century, and everything that branched off of it, at least the composers that I've met, they don't consider themselves to be minimalist. Coming from the school where I was coming from, it would be, but once I got to know their styles, this post minimalism, for lack of a better way, because most people don't like that term either. Once I got to know it, I actually found out why they wouldn't call it minimalism. They were actually developing the music as it went on. There was a technique, and I'm sorry I don't remember the name, but I believe it was from Philip Glass, who many consider to be a minimalist composer, but he does not.
Mm.
Where he would take triads, and you could move to another harmony based on any note in that triad. For example,
Like a pivot chord.
a bit exactly, and that became the entire structure of the music. If
Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know the name of that technique. I forget it, but yeah, I mean that right there, that's form.
Yeah.
That's development in music
Yeah.
that uses harmony, traditional harm or traditional chordal structures, but not traditional function.
Well, and so that is going to take us to the Craig Michael Davis saxophone. Is a saxophone quartet?
No, no, this was a.
I never saw the point of breathing. It's a
Oh, right,
saxophone.
right, yeah. I'm sorry, I was looking for another piece of
Is it a
his.
quartet?
It. Let's see. Actually, I don't know. I found this piece. Craig's a friend of mine, and I've been listening to his music lately, and
This
I'm
is a
not
very
sure.
cool piece of music.
It was. It
And I
was.
assume it's because, very few players can circular breathe. And I think Kenny G was an exception who could just keep the phrase going. I never saw the point of breathing because it's sounds that it's hard to find places to breathe, I assume.
Yeah. When I was listening to it, I thought the same thing because of I mean, there wasn't as much rest. I don't mean that in a bad way, of course, but it was a piece that just continued to go on. Craig is again, I don't want to say the post minimalism because I don't know if he would agree with that, but I do know that he was a huge fan of Philip Glass.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely heard that.
Yeah,
And even when you just hear that sonority, you think Philip Glass, like saxophones playing together, Philip Glass. So, I mean,
yeah,
yeah, it's a great piece, to, especially like to put out in the background, like, and just to, lose yourself a little bit,
yeah,
dream.
yeah.
Um, so that brings us to our last piece, which blew me away as well. Jefferson Friedman's Second String Quartet, written in 1999.
Yeah.
And actually, I don't know which recording you heard. I'm assuming there's only one or two recordings.
I believe there's two.
Okay, but this one, there's a remix by Matmos,
Yeah, that was on the same album.
which is fantastic.
Yeah.
And then also, I mean, the second string quartet, but I was also listening to the third string quartet, which I think was composed about 2005.
Hmm.
And just, yeah, fantastic music. It's my understanding he has a very tight relationship with this string quartet he works with. I can't remember their name.
The Kiara Quartet.
Kiara, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, as far as I know, they're no longer together.
Okay, well, that's string quartet life.
Yeah.
Can you talk about just what drew you? Because I wasn't aware of Jeff. I mean, I see that he had some works premiered with like the National Symphony and Leonard Slacken, but I couldn't find them.
Yeah.
Can you talk about these string quartets? And I know you have some string quartets that you've written. Can you talk about how that's influenced you or what you find appealing in these?
Yeah, I have to say that this is probably the one piece that has influenced me the most. It's a very special piece to me. I'm sure people who play this piece or listen to it and then play my work or listen to it, they'll probably catch the threads between them. I started listening to this piece to get an idea on what music sounded like in the 21st century. Very similar to the Higdon, but this was before that. Um, this piece, I wanted to get a better handle on contemporary composition as well as contemporary string writing. I found this piece just with a Google search, totally at random. I didn't know who Jefferson Friedman was. I didn't know who his teacher was. I found out that his teacher was John Crigliano, which I'm very familiar with now, but this is back when I first started. Jefferson went to Juilliard. I believe he did his master's there, and he met the Chiara Quartet. They were, I believe, the quartet in residence at Juilliard at the time. And I want to say, commissioned his first string quartet, which isn't published. I've never heard it.
Hmm.
the second quartet, and then the third quartet. And as you've heard both of them, the second and the third. Jefferson Friedman went on to start composing orchestral music, which I've also heard, um, which I thought it was brilliant. I don't know if they have published recordings or not, but I'll have to try and look for them and send them to you if I can find them. But the second string quartet, um, it seemed to stay traditional when it came to the formal structure. It was clear ternary form for the first and last movement, and then the second movement was this binary form. But it was just very well polished structurally. But when it came to the actual composition of it, it was like nothing I had ever heard. It seemed to be a nice blend of tertian structure chords as well as the dissonant sounds that we're used to hearing from the 20th century. It's a piece that I still study. I mean, I first found this maybe in 2011 or so. I purchased the score. I still have the score. I still look at it from time to time. I listened to the whole piece today, actually. It's a piece that I return to since I know it by heart, but I return to it now maybe once every season
Hmm.
just to give myself that taste of what this sound is again.
That's amazing. Yeah, there's life experiences put you, they go with music, right? Like if I if something, a memory comes back, or if I'm going through something, it's always associated with some piece of music, or and that's why I can never be a composer, because all the melodies in here are not original. I was listening to this actually the second movement of his third string quartet this morning, early in the morning, like 5 in the morning when I got up, and I was reading this article in New York Magazine or New York Times or something about these nurses and doctors in Italy that just they get up and they wake up and their first inclination is save people's lives, care for people. So this was the musical backdrop of his third string quartet. And I know you mentioned it was his second string quartet, but if people get a chance to hear this whole album, the second movement of his third string quartet, and I think it really progresses histrionically. But that second movement is just so moving. And Jonathan, I wanted to thank you for sharing your playlist, and I hope if people are still listening now, they will see the playlist below and they'll listen to some of these great quarantunes for quarantimes. And because all of this is fantastic music, and thank you for opening my mind up to a lot of this stuff. And I was just looking before we close out, I just wanted to remind you, we did 4 premieres, and you probably know this, but we did Dichotomy, the episode for orchestra, Quaternity, and the violin concerto.
And there was 5. The Christmas concert.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, Christmas
Yeah.
concert. I didn't conduct that. That's
Oh,
right.
That's right.
So yeah, so Jonathan's got some amazing. I mean, if you get exhausted with his playlist, check out his music. I'm sure his recordings are on his website. We'll share links below. And thank you so much, Jonathan, for your time and for your skills and your talent. And please keep putting music into the world for us.
Oh, well, it was a pleasure talking with you, Devin. Always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much.